You said something recently on Twitter that kind of liberalism's failure to have an honest conversation about Islam and violence inherent to Islam is what creates the openness to the demagoguery of Donald Trump. Can you flesh that out for me a little bit more?
Well, it comes down to, I mean, this is kind of an open secret. This is in plain view for everyone to see. We know that ISIS, to take the most extreme example, that the members of this death cult sincerely believe well-articulated doctrines that come straight out of Scripture. And they are good Muslims. There are places to stand within the Muslim tradition where you can criticize some of what they're doing. But the problem, really the horror of our circumstance, is that it is very difficult to say how ISIS is distorting the central teachings of Islam. I mean, if you read the Quran and you read the Hadith and you read the biography of Muhammad and you ask yourself, what is ISIS doing that Muhammad wouldn't do or would have clearly objected to? That is not an easy question to answer. And down to, decapitating his enemies and taking sex slaves and throwing gays off of rooftops, all of it. These are precisely the sorts of things that Muhammad did. If he led by example, if Muhammad was the best person who ever lived, well, then it gets you something very close to ISIS, right? And then we're having to read the fine print to figure out how it doesn't apply in our time. Now, anyone who is not admitting this is either an ignoramus or is lying about Islam. And that is a huge problem. So when our president gets up and says that ISIS is not Islamic, and he refuses to use the word Islam in any other context, and he talks as though we're at war with generic terrorism, as though we might be at war with the IRA too at this moment, people get the sense that they're being lied to. And the people who can sense this most clearly are not you and your fellow Reformed Jews, but Bible-thumping religious maniacs of another flavor, people who are sure that Jesus is the Son of God, born of a virgin, rose from the dead, and will be coming back to earth to judge the sinners and throw them into a lake of fire. These people know what it's like to believe their holy book to be true. So they look at ISIS and they have no illusions about what these guys are up to. They know when these guys say, we love death more than the infidel loves life, and when they talk about conquering the world, they know that they can take them at their word, right? It's only the secularist and the atheist and the moderate and the person who's had his purchase on this kind of medieval theology relaxed by all that we enjoy in the modern world. It's only that person who's left thinking, well, maybe it's not really religion. Maybe they don't really believe what they say they believe. No, it's religion. And so,
okay, but let me just look. You had President Bush who said this is not a war on Islam. Not to come out and indict 1.6 billion Muslims the world over and say that we are at war with your religion, when, look, you established in your most recent books that, 15% of the world's Muslims who might believe in this kind of fanaticism, which, by the way, is a scarily high percentage, as you establish in your book. But we are still talking about this subset of those who are believers.
Yeah, and it's not a matter of demonizing all Muslims, of course not, but it's a matter of talking honestly about the consequences of ideas. And I mean, so one thing what you just said brings up is it's something that I'm now calling the narrative. There's this piece of common knowledge that seems to be spreading through Western societies that strikes me as almost unrivaled in its strangeness, and yet people who hear it for the first time, and to say nothing of the people who actually espouse it, they never seem to notice that something out of the ordinary is being said. And so the idea is this. The idea is that in fighting ISIS, or in resisting the spread of Islamic theocracy more generally, we must at all costs avoid, quote, confirming the narrative of Islamic extremists. So the fear is that any focus on the religion of Islam or its adherents, like profiling at the TSA or intelligence gathering at mosques, or merely acknowledging that we're at war not with generic terrorism, but with Islamic terrorism in particular. The fear is that this will drive many more Muslims into the arms of the jihadists. They'll become jihadists because of this. But now, think about what is actually being alleged here. I mean, think about the underlying horror and paranoia of this claim. I mean, let's say, this isn't a perfect analogy, but it should work. Let's say you're a bald white man, right? And just unhappily for you, there happens to be a global insurgency of neo-Nazi skinheads just terrorizing 100 countries, right? So most white men are perfectly peaceful. But this insurgency has grown so widespread and so captivating to a minority of white men that no city on earth is safe, right? So, bald white men have blown up planes and buses and burned embassies, and they've even murdered innocent children by the hundreds, point blank. And we have now spent trillions of dollars trying to contain this damage. And many of these white men are seeking nuclear materials so that they can detonate dirty bombs or even atomic ones. And to make matters worse, many of them are just avowedly suicidal and therefore undeterrable. Now, imagine what it would be like to hear presidents and prime ministers and newspaper columnists and even your own fellow white bald men express the fear that merely acknowledging the whiteness and baldness of neo-Nazi skinheads would so oppress and alienate other white bald men that they too would begin murdering innocent people. Okay, imagine being told that at all costs we can't confirm the narrative of neo-Nazis by acknowledging that white bald men festooned with swastikas pose a greater security interest than elderly Hawaiian women, or for instance. I mean, so that any kind of focus on people who look like this, it could be so offensive that it will lead other white men to act out in this completely insane way. Now, this is either the most pessimistic and uncharitable thing ever said about a community, in the case of the world's 1.6 billion Muslims, or it's true. Okay, now if it's the former, if it's just pure paranoia to be saying this, well, then we should stop saying it, right? But if it's the latter, if it's actually a legitimate fear, right, that calling a spade here will drive some terrifying number of otherwise ordinary Muslims into the arms of theocrats, right, so that these people will then be, quote, radicalized. They'll then be calling for clitorectomies for their daughters, right? Or they'll be supporting people who throw gays from rooftops. Well, then we should be talking about nothing else, okay? And we should be obliging Muslims to talk about nothing else. I mean, this is the most bizarre and just uncanny fact about our world at this moment, if true.
Well, and it certainly makes sense to me that even in a political debate, you do have to be specific that we are dealing with radical Islamic terrorists whose literal interpretation of their sacred texts are leading them to be, Islamists who want to foist their religious views upon their societies, acquire land, and, create a civilization hearkening back to the 7th century when that civilization was a centerpiece of the world. But there is such a thing as pernicious hate speech that can move societies, right? I mean, if we think about anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany or even in the medieval period in terms of spreading information about Jews and so forth. I mean, do you think that's a legitimate fear?
Well, so to come back to your original question here, this is the problem. Because liberals have ceded this ground based on political correctness and based on this just sinister meme of Islamophobia that just shuts down conversation on this topic and has been consciously engineered to do so, by the way. The only people left to make sense are increasingly bigots and xenophobes and people you generally would worry about having an alliance with. So, the people who make similar noises to the ones I'm making now about Islam are people who are making those noises for the wrong reasons. These are people who are not especially worried about the maintenance of civil society and free speech and the rights of women. And these are people who, in certain cases, are theocrats of, their own sort, invariably the Christian sort, or they're, fascists in Europe who just hate the idea of having immigrants at all coming into their countries. So this abdication of intellectual honesty on this point among liberals has left right-wing nut jobs, very often the only people left to make sense on this topic.
Sam Harris, what an interesting conversation. Thank you very much for your views.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, David.